March 1st, 1870, a shallow stream in the forests of Cerro Corá, northern Paraguay. Brazilian cavalry crash through the undergrowth. They find a man standing in the water, wounded, blood spreading across his gold-embroidered marshal's uniform. His 14-year-old son lies dying at his feet. The man is Francisco Solano López, president of Paraguay. He clutches his chest where a lance has pierced him. He raises his sword one final time. A Brazilian soldier lifts his rifle. López shouts something. Historians still argue whether he cried, "I die for my nation," or the darker truth, "I die with my nation." The rifle cracks. The man falls. Both versions were true. Behind López lay a country that had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. 5 years, 2 months, and 15 days earlier, he had launched a war believing Paraguay would dominate South America. Now his nation was a corpse. The numbers are almost impossible to believe. Modern scholarship debates the exact figures. Some say 60–69% of the entire population perished. Others argue 2–50%. But all agree on one horrifying statistic. Between 60 and 90% of Paraguayan men died. Not soldiers, men. The male population of an entire nation virtually extinct. This is the story of how one man's dream of empire became his country's funeral. Before diving into this forgotten story of ambition and annihilation, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Now, let's talk about what makes this war so uniquely catastrophic. Paraguay didn't lose a battle. It didn't lose a war. It lost its future. To understand how this happened, you need to understand where Paraguay stood in 1864, because the nation that walked into this conflict was not some backward colonial outpost. Paraguay was a paradox, a landlocked country surrounded by giants, yet punching far above its weight. To the south sprawled Argentina, with 10 times Paraguay's population. To the north and east loomed Brazil, South America's colossus, a slave-holding empire with seemingly endless resources. To the southwest sat tiny Uruguay, a buffer state perpetually squeezed between Argentine and Brazilian ambitions. Paraguay was trapped in the middle, with no access to the sea except through rivers controlled by its neighbors. Everything about its geography screamed vulnerability. Yet, by 1864, Paraguay had become something remarkable. Under Carlos Antonio López, Francisco's father, who ruled from 1844 to 1862, Paraguay had modernized with shocking speed: railways, telegraph lines, and ironworks at Ubique producing cannons and tools, a small but professional army of 28,000 to 40,000 men equipped with modern rifles and artillery. Carlos López had ended decades of isolation and built South America's first railway. When he died in 1862, his son Francisco inherited a nation that was self-sufficient, militarized, and proud. It had no debt. It had infrastructure. It had an army that believed it could win. Francisco Solano López was 35 years old when he became president. He had been educated in Europe, particularly in Paris during the 1850s, where he absorbed the cult of Napoleon Bonaparte like a drug. He returned to Paraguay accompanied by Eliza Lynch, an Irish courtesan who became his mistress and de facto first lady, scandalizing Asunción's society. López was stocky, mustachioed, obsessed with military pageantry. He wore elaborate uniforms dripping with gold braid. He modelled himself on Napoleon. But here's the problem. He mistook the costume for the genius. He believed that courage and will could overcome logistics and mathematics. He was wrong, and his error would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But in 1864, López didn't see himself as delusional. He saw himself as a realist responding to an existential threat. Brazil and Argentina had been maneuvering for decades to control Uruguay and, through Uruguay, access to Paraguay's rivers. Those rivers, the Paraná and Paraguay, were Paraguay's only highways to the Atlantic Ocean. If Brazil dominated Uruguay, Paraguay would be strangled economically and politically. So when Brazil invaded Uruguay in August 1864 to support a pro-Brazilian faction in that country's civil war, López calculated that he had to act. His thinking went like this: strike first, strike hard, create a Paraguayan-dominated alliance that could balance Brazilian power, force Brazil to back down, secure Paraguay's independence. His fundamental miscalculation was this: he believed he could fight Brazil and Argentina simultaneously. He thought they would fold quickly. He thought European powers might intervene. He thought wrong. On November 12, 1864, Paraguayan soldiers seized a Brazilian warship, the Marquês de Olinda, in Asunción's harbour. It wasn't a declaration of war, it was a provocation, a signal that Paraguay would not be intimidated. 1 month later, on December 14th, Paraguayan columns invaded Brazil's Mato Grosso province, a remote frontier region barely defended. The invasion succeeded brilliantly at first. Paraguayan troops captured Brazilian forts and advanced deep into enemy territory. López believed momentum was on his side. To reach Uruguay, to actually aid his allies there, López needed to cross Argentine territory, specifically the province of Corrientes. In January 1865, he requested permission from Argentine President Bartolomé Mitre. Mitre refused, so López invaded anyway. Think about that decision for a moment. López invaded a neutral country to fight a war against another country. In April and May of 1865, Paraguayan forces crossed into Argentina and seized Corrientes. This single decision transformed the war. Argentina, previously neutral, now entered the conflict against Paraguay. López had turned one enemy into two. On May 1, 1865, Brazil, Argentina and Uruguay signed the Treaty of the Triple Alliance in Buenos Aires. The secret articles revealed later showed the Allies' war aims: overthrow López, redistribute Paraguayan territory between Brazil and Argentina, extract massive reparations. The alliance could field combined forces of 40,000 to 50,000 initially. Brazil would eventually contribute perhaps 140,000 to 150,000 troops over the war's duration. Paraguay's entire population was somewhere between 300,000 and 450,000 people. The Allies could replace losses, Paraguay could not. Here's where geography becomes destiny. Paraguay is landlocked. The Allied fleet, especially Brazil's ironclad warships, controlled the rivers. The Paraguayan navy, though spirited, was outgunned from the start. Brazilian ironclads steamed up the Paraguay River like floating fortresses. López's modernized nation now faced a logistical nightmare, fighting in swamps, forests and river systems against enemies with superior numbers and naval supremacy. Every bullet, every rifle, every pound of gunpowder had to be manufactured inside Paraguay or smuggled through enemy lines. The Allies could resupply from the Atlantic. Paraguay was sealed in. The early stages of the war, however, gave López false hope. Paraguayan soldiers fought with ferocious courage. They were well-trained, well-equipped by South American standards, and utterly committed. In the opening battles, they gave as good as they got. But courage doesn't win wars. Logistics does. Mathematics does. And the mathematics were brutal. May 24, 1866, the Battle of Tuyuti. This was the bloodiest single day in South American history, and it revealed everything about the war's trajectory. López, still believing he could deliver a knockout blow, ordered 25,000 Paraguayan troops to assault the Allied camp at Tuyuti. The attack was brave, it was ferocious, it was suicidal. In a matter of hours, between 6,000 and 7,000 Paraguayan soldiers lay dead in the mud. Allied casualties were around 4,000. On paper, that looks like an exchange ratio of less than 2. But here's the thing. Brazil could afford 4,000 dead. Paraguay could not afford 6,000. Every Paraguayan corpse at Tuyuti was irreplaceable. Every Brazilian corpse would be replaced by next month's shipment of recruits. This battle exposed López's fundamental error. He was fighting like Napoleon at Austerlitz. Massed columns, decisive assault, glory through audacity. But this wasn't 1805 Europe. This was 1866 South America. A war of attrition in swamplands where courage meant nothing against artillery barrages and superior numbers. López kept ordering attacks. His men kept dying. And slowly, terrifyingly, the demographics shifted. By late 1866, Paraguay had lost so many men that López began conscripting younger and younger soldiers, boys aged 15, then 14, then 12. Eyewitness accounts from this period are nightmarish. Allied soldiers described capturing Paraguayan troops who could barely lift their rifles. Children dressed in uniforms too large for their bodies, marching toward Brazilian artillery positions because a madman in a gold-braided uniform had ordered them to. Some carried fake rifles, sticks painted black, because there weren't enough real guns left. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to 1866 and 1867, because for 2 years the war entered a different phase, the Siege of Humaitá. Humaitá was a massive fortress complex on a bend in the Paraguay River, bristling with cannons protected by swamps and earthworks. López retreated behind these fortifications and dared the Allies to come get him. For 2 years they tried. The sieges were medieval in their horror. Cholera swept through both armies, yellow fever, dysentery, men died choking on their own fluids, their bodies turning yellow and black. Brazilian troops, unaccustomed to the tropical diseases of the interior, died by the thousands, but Brazil had reserves. Troop ships kept arriving from Rio de Janeiro, offloading fresh soldiers who would march to the front, contract cholera, and die in the mud. The machine kept grinding. In July 1867, the Duke of Caxias arrived to take command of the Brazilian forces. Caxias was 62 years old, a veteran of Brazil's internal wars, conservative, methodical, and utterly unsentimental. Where previous Brazilian commanders had hurled men at Humaitá's walls, Cacias implemented a strategy of patient strangulation. He flanked. He besieged. He used Brazil's naval superiority to cut off Paraguayan supply lines. Slowly, systematically, he tightened the noose. Caxias understood what Lopez refused to accept. This wasn't a war that would be won by heroic charges. This was a war of logistics, resources, and time. Brazil had all three. Paraguay had none. Caxias could wait. So he waited. And while he waited, Paraguay starved. By 1868, the situation inside Paraguay had become apocalyptic. Lopez conscripted everyone. Boys aged 10 joined battalions that were barely armed mobs. Women carried ammunition under fire. Old men fought. Witnesses described seeing entire units composed of children, some so young they had to be lifted onto their horses, marching to battles they couldn't possibly survive. This wasn't war anymore. It was national immolation, a collective suicide dressed up as patriotic resistance. And here's the thing, many Paraguayans believed in it. Lopez had cultivated a cult of personality so intense that even as the nation collapsed, even as children died by the thousands, many of his people genuinely saw him as their savior. Some historians argue he was a dictator who hypnotized his population through propaganda and terror. Others argue he represented genuine nationalist resistance against imperial aggression. The truth is probably both. Lopez was a dictator. He also genuinely believed he was saving his nation. And his people followed him into the abyss. One figure stands out in this madness, Eliza Lynch. The Irish courtesan who became Lopez's mistress remained by his side throughout the entire war. She gave birth to his children during the conflict. She accompanied the army on its retreats. Some accounts describe her as Lady Macbeth, whispering encouragement into Lopez's ear as the body count mounted. Others paint her as a tragic figure, trapped by circumstance and genuine love. She refused to abandon Lopez even as the nation disintegrated. Later, after his death, she would dig his grave with her bare hands. But we're not there yet. January 1869, the Allied armies finally break through. They capture Asunción, Paraguay's capital. The city is nearly empty. Most of its population has fled or died. The war is over. Except Lopez refuses to believe it. He retreats into the northern wilderness with the remnants of his army, skeletal soldiers, child troops, his mistress, his ministers, perhaps a few thousand people total. And for 14 more months he wages a phantom war. This final phase is where the story becomes almost surreal. Allied columns hunt Lopez through jungles like tracking a wounded animal. His army shrinks from thousands to hundreds to dozens. He moves from camp to camp, always one step ahead of capture, and as the noose tightens, his paranoia explodes. He begins executing suspected traitors. His own brothers, cabinet members, priests. Anyone he suspects of disloyalty dies. He's convinced that betrayal, not overwhelming enemy superiority, explains his defeat. He cannot process the reality that he simply lost. March 1st, 1870, Brazilian cavalry, under General José Francisco Lacerda, nicknamed Chico Diabo, Frank the Devil, surprised Lopez's camp near the Aquidauban River at Cerro Corá. The battle is barely worthy of the name. Perhaps 200 ragged Paraguayans against 700+ Brazilian troops. It's a massacre. Lopez, already wounded by a lance thrust, tries to flee toward the river. He's bleeding. His uniform is torn. His son Panchito, 14 years old, fights beside him and is cut down. Lopez stumbles into the stream. A Brazilian corporal, not an officer, a corporal, shoots him dead. Eliza Lynch is captured. The Brazilians won't let her bury her lover's body properly, so she digs his grave and Panchito's grave with her bare hands, clawing at the earth until her fingers bleed. Then she's expelled from Paraguay, the country she had called home for 15 years. She dies in poverty in Paris 16 years later. Paraguay eventually rehabilitates her memory. Today she's honored as a national heroine. But in that moment, covered in mud and blood, she represents the end of everything. Now let's talk about the aftermath, because the numbers are almost beyond comprehension. Paraguay's pre-war population was somewhere between 300,000 and 450,000 people. Post-war censuses show roughly 160,000 to 220,000 survivors. Even the most conservative estimates suggest a 2.540% total population loss. Higher estimates reach 6.069%. But those are the overall figures. The male population loss was proportionally far worse. Here's what we know. Among military-age men, roughly 15 to 50 years old, the death rate was catastrophic. Some estimates put it at 90%. The 1886 census, 16 years after the war's end, showed 3 women for every man over 30. An entire generation of Paraguayan men had been erased. Walk through Asunción in 1871 and you'd see widows, children without fathers, old men who survived because they were too old to fight, and eerie silence where young men's voices should have been. The territorial losses were staggering. Paraguay lost approximately 140,000 square kilometers to Brazil and Argentina, 25% of its pre-war land. The most resource-rich areas, including the Chaco region, were carved up. Reparations were imposed that Paraguay would never fully pay. Allied occupation lasted until 1876. When the Brazilian and Argentine troops finally left, they left behind a country that would take generations to recover. But here's where history gets complicated. How you interpret this war depends entirely on which narrative you accept. In Brazil and Argentina, López is remembered as a delusional dictator who destroyed his own nation through insane ambition, a South American Napoleon who lacked Napoleon's genius, a madman who conscripted children and fought a war that was lost from day one. In Paraguay, López is remembered as a martyr, the man who saved Paraguay from complete partition. Without his resistance, the argument goes, Brazil and Argentina would have divided Paraguay between them, and the nation would have ceased to exist entirely. Yes, the cost was horrific. Yes, most of the male population died. But Paraguay survived as a country. Its flag still flies. Its language, Guarani, is still spoken. López's refusal to surrender, in this telling, preserved the nation's existence. Which version is true? Both. Neither. History doesn't do simple morality. López was a nationalist who genuinely believed he was defending his country. He was also a dictator who sent children to die for his ego. The Brazilian and Argentine empires were imperialist powers carving up smaller neighbors. They were also responding to López's invasions of their territory. Everyone has blood on their hands. Everyone has a justification. What's inarguable is the war's legacy. No Latin American nation attempted such military adventurism again for generations. The war was too fresh, the lesson too clear. Small nations cannot defeat large coalitions through courage alone. Brazil abolished slavery in 1888, partly due to social pressures from Afro-Brazilian veterans who had fought in Paraguay and returned demanding rights. Argentina consolidated its hold over its frontier territories. And Paraguay rebuilt, slowly, painfully, its demography skewed for decades. The war also foreshadowed the industrialized slaughter of World War I, trench warfare, massive casualties from disease, the complete mobilization of society, children, women, the elderly, the erasure of the line between soldier and civilian. Humanitarian sieges looked less like 1866 and more like Verdun. The Paraguayan conscription of 10-year-olds prefigured total war. Cerro Corá was a preview of modernity's capacity for organized death. And here's what haunts me about this story: the children. Because by 1869, Paraguay's army wasn't really an army. It was a procession of children in oversized uniforms, carrying rifles they could barely aim, marching toward Brazilian artillery because a man in a gold-braided coat told them to. Allied soldiers wrote about it later, described the horror of killing boys who should have been in school. Some refused to fire. Others did their duty and then drank themselves numb that night. The children died believing they were heroes. Maybe they were. Maybe heroism is just another word for waste. Francisco Solano López died in a stream believing he had saved his nation. He hadn't. But he hadn't destroyed it either, not entirely. Paraguay survived. Broken, bleeding, demographically catastrophic, but alive. Whether that survival justified the cost is a question each person has to answer for themselves. The war killed between 6090% of Paraguayan men. It killed the dream of Paraguayan regional dominance. It killed the idea that willpower could overcome mathematics. It killed hundreds of thousands of people, soldiers, civilians, children, women, and for what? National pride? Imperial ambition? The ego of one man who thought he was Napoleon? History doesn't give neat answers. It gives bodies in streams, and women digging graves with their hands. It gives us Eliza Lynch, expelled and penniless, dying in Paris while Paraguay slowly counted its dead. It gives us the Duke of Caxias, methodical and victorious, returning to Brazil as a hero. It gives us Bartolomé Mitre, who withdrew from active command because even he found the slaughter distasteful. It gives us a country where, for decades after the war, women vastly outnumbered men, where an entire generation of children grew up without fathers. And it gives us this question: when does self-defense become suicide? When does patriotism become mass murder? When does a leader's refusal to surrender become a crime against his own people? López stood in that stream with his dying son beside him and believed he had done the right thing. The corpses of hundreds of thousands of his countrymen suggested otherwise. But in Paraguay today, you can visit his monument. You can see statues erected in his honor. History is written by the survivors, and in this case, the survivors decided their destroyer was their savior. Maybe that's the only way they could live with what happened. Maybe venerating López as a martyr was psychologically necessary for a nation trying to rebuild from near extinction. Or maybe they're right. Maybe without López's insane resistance, Paraguay would have been completely erased, divided between Brazil and Argentina, its language and culture extinct. We'll never know the counterfactual. What we know is this: between 1864 and 1870, One of the deadliest wars in human history relative to population occurred in South America, and most of the world forgot about it. We remember the American Civil War, we remember the Napoleonic Wars, we barely remember the war that killed 90% of Paraguay's men. But the dead don't care about our memory. They're still there, in unmarked graves across Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. Boys who never became men. Men who died for a dream that turned into a nightmare. Women who buried their sons and husbands and lovers and then had to keep living. That's the war. That's the cost. And that's why, when a Brazilian corporal shot Francisco Solano López in a muddy stream in 1870, he didn't just kill a dictator, he ended an apocalypse. If this story affected you, let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? What wars has your country forgotten? History is full of tragedies like this, nations that gambled everything and lost. Paraguay's story deserves to be remembered, not because it's heroic, but because it's true. And the truth, no matter how ugly, is always worth knowing.